Welcome to Bible study tonight. All those who are going to be watching this on Facebook Live. We're just about to get into the meat of our tonight. We're done with our prayer, and we heard a poem about the Tower of Babel. Is right now, folks in small groups are looking at chapter 10, which is a series of genealogies, and they are recognizing names, finding some of the names in the genealogies that are familiar to them for any reason. So that's what they're doing right now. And we've recapped a little bit about what this Bible study is about as well. And so one of the things I want to remind you is folks are welcome to email me with questions during the week, and I hope to address the best I can those questions at our next Bible study. And so right now we're going to get ready to call everybody back together. We're going to talk a little bit about Genesis chapters 10 and 11. All right, so I'm guessing you found some. Good. Good work. Good work. Good work. So again, as we look at chapter 10, we are once again, we have the same issue that's come up a few other times in Genesis so far. That is the issue of all of the people of the earth coming from one small family. Historically, practically, a little difficult to reconcile, right? And also, it's probably one of those things you don't want to think about too much. Don't want to put too much thought into this. It's a pretty small group. It could be a little disturbing if you're thinking too much about how everybody in the world came from 3 sons and presumably their wives. However, it also speaks to something else. It also speaks to one of the primary purposes of this book of Genesis. This book gives us the deep roots of a family tree. Once again, the people of the Exodus, with all of their diversity, the slaves who left Egypt, can look back at this to find their roots. And now they can look not only back to Adam and Eve, but they can also look back to Noah's family. This is an important feature of a prehistory like Genesis. It gives the people a shared story. They can all trace their roots back to the same place. And that's an important feature in Genesis. Like we said, we've seen it in the creation stories. We're seeing it in the Noah story. We're going to see it again as we get to the Abraham story, where God says, I will make you the father of many nations. This is a story of common roots. And if you look at it as a story of common roots, it makes a lot more sense than just looking at it as a historical tracing of a family. So that's great for the people of the Exodus. This is important for the people of the Exodus. They could look back at these genealogies and trace themselves to common ancestors. But what about us? It's good for them, but what do we do with these genealogies? I don't know if anybody was thinking that. Probably you were thinking, oh my gosh, I wish these genealogies were longer. Is that what folks were thinking? I wish these were a lot longer. They're very interesting. Yes. So you might have been wondering as you're reading them, okay, we've had some pretty exciting stuff, like God created the world, there was the flood. There's been some pretty good stuff. And now an entire chapter of names. It's a tougher narrative. Doesn't really drive as well. So you may be wondering, what about us? What do we do with these? What do we do with these genealogies? Are they still meaningful? Are they still worthwhile thousands of years later? Are they still worthwhile? It's a little complicated because they are Holy Scripture, right? I mean, they were right beside all the other stuff. All in the same book, everything else we've read. Nobody was questioning, like, why would we be interested in this creation story? I think everybody thought, oh, this creation story is interesting. This says a lot about God. But they're right beside each other. I mean, right? They're in the same book. some of the same authors. They are Holy Scripture. How do we distinguish which stories or sayings or writings are more or less important for us? That's a good question. I'm not just saying that because I asked it. It really is a good question. I think that one of the ways we do this is we're going through the Bible bit by bit, right? We're looking at it and we're examining it and we're studying it, and we're recognizing that studying the Bible is not easy, right? It's a complex book. There's a lot going on. It's not that easy. And we have questions like this of how do we decide if something is more or less important to our lives as Christians in 2016. And that's why we're putting in this work. That's why we come on Wednesday. That's why you're doing your readings during the week. That's why you're asking questions of the text. And probably what we're going to find through this Bible study is we're going to find that sometimes things that we did not think were that important are maybe a little more central to our faith, maybe nurture our faith more than we expected. And some things that we had formerly thought were very, very important, we read now and we think, well, maybe this doesn't move me as much as I remembered it did. So we're going to have these relationships with the Bible, and hopefully we'll be surprised a lot of times that there are incredibly meaningful things that God is really speaking through us in parts of the Bible that we did not expect. That there's more to the Bible than maybe we remembered. I hope that that's something that we discover, but we discover that by going through the Bible bit by bit and looking at the pieces and asking ourselves, why is this important? Or what does this really mean? Or where does this come from? Or where's the deeper meaning? So what is the purpose? What's the goal of the genealogy in chapter 10? So what we found here is that the genealogy is being traced through Noah and his 3 sons and presumably their wives. We're seeing that here the people took seriously God's commandment after the flood to be fruitful and multiply. Right? So this is one of the things God said after the ark landed. God says to Noah, to his sons, to his family, be fruitful and multiply. Chapter 10 is proof that they took that seriously. Right? It's also interesting to notice that the sons' descendants are broken into geographical regions of the known world. I was going around and folks were saying, some of these are places. Some of these names are places. That's true. We have cities, nations, all listed as one individual in family lines. Some of the places are still known. Some of them we'll experience later in the Torah. We're going to see these place names come up again and again and again. Some are no longer known. We don't know where they are, where they were. They're places that had been at one time in the memory of the writer of Genesis, but have since faded from memory. So once again, we are getting an origin story. We've talked about this a lot in Genesis, right? These origin stories, tracing the beginning of things. And in this case, it's tracing the establishment of the author's known world. This answers the question of, where did our neighbors come from? There are other people around us. It's not just our nation. We keep encountering other nations. Where'd they come from? This genealogy is an attempt to answer that question. So we start with Noah's son Japheth, and we say that his sons are the people who inhabited the areas north and northwest of biblical Israel, in what we would see now as the modern areas of Turkey and Greece and Cyprus. And then we have Ham's sons. And Ham's sons occupy the areas south of biblical Israel, modern areas in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Libya. And then you have Shem's sons, and Shem's sons occupy the areas east of biblical Israel. Modern areas of Syria and Iraq and Iran. It's the origin of the peoples of the known world. Now, it is important for us to remember, as we're reading this biblical text, that this is the biblical writer's perspective. This is the biblical writer's known world, for one. There were clearly people in other parts of the world at times when this biblical text is being written. The biblical writer was not taking airplanes around the world, didn't necessarily know that there were people all over the place, but knew a certain area around where they were located and had the exact same perspective on their origins. Right? So the people of these lands, if you ask them at the same time, they would not say, oh, well, we go back to Noah's flood as recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. That would not have been their answer to their origin story. But from the biblical writer's perspective, it was. And so it's an important reminder that the Bible is a book of a community written for that community. The writers were writing to other people who were a part of their nation, of their tribe, of their people, and communicating, here is our understanding of our God. They weren't necessarily sending this out to all the other nations of the world for fact-checking. Right? This is written from a certain perspective for a certain audience. Now, there's also a little bit of a dark side to this genealogy. So, the story of Ham and his sons, we see first at the end of the Noah story. Something happened after the flood between Noah and his son Ham. The Bible is not entirely clear about what exactly that was. What we do know is that Noah was passed out drunk in his tent, and he was naked. Ham saw him. Ham goes out and tells his brothers. It's unclear in the text if we're supposed to read into that something had happened, or if it was just as simple of he saw him and didn't do anything about it, or he saw him and gossiped about it. It's really unclear in the text. It's open to interpretation. And so, because that happens, when Noah comes to and finds out, he curses not Ham, but Ham's son Canaan. Cursed by Noah. So why does that matter? Well, Canaan, who would be considered the father of the Canaanites, who we're going to read a lot about in the Old Testament, they were a neighbor of the Hebrew people. Sometimes they were neighbors in conflict with each other, sometimes fighting over the same land. This story in the Noah story, this cursing, it served as a justification for the acts of war that would later be committed. It served as justification for conquering the people and their property. You remember that one of the things Noah says is, you'll be a slave to the other sons. You'll be a slave to them. And so when folks went in, conquered, there was a justification built into the story. This is what Noah said. This is what God wanted. So that's how it plays out in the one hand. Not only is Canaan, a son of Ham, become an enemy, but there are other sons of Ham who also become enemies of Israel at various times in their history. Now, one of the dark, sort of the dark side that continues to live, like this dark tendency here continues to live, and it lives even into more modern history. These negative stories that are told in Genesis are co-opted later. So you're going to have things like the Canaan story. We're also going to see this happen with Lot's daughters. Like the children of that incestuous relationship are the names of neighbor enemies, right? And that becomes the origin story of those people, and in some way gives permission to treat them in certain ways. So this story was also a story, the story of Ham and his son in the slavery became a story that was used to justify African slave trade. So it was said then, as people look back on the text, if you want to justify yourself, you can be very creative looking at a biblical text. And so folks would look back and say, well, the descendants of Ham went south. That must mean they're the African people. They are, in the Bible it says they're going to be slaves, so I guess that justifies it. This is what God wants. So one of the reasons it's important to study the Bible, because if you want to justify the evil things you're doing, using the Bible is a good way to do it. And so that's why we study. One, so we don't make those mistakes, but two, so we don't let other folks get away with those things. One of the ways that the Ham story was used throughout history later. In some way kind of similar, using it to justify oppressing other people a long time ago, continued to carry that out today. And so we study the Bible. One of the questions that we have this week that comes out of this genealogy is what was the significance of Nimrod as the first mighty man? What was the significance of Nimrod as the first mighty man? Well, you got to say, Nimrod stands out in this list, right? I mean, you're reading the list, and it's like this person, this is their son, this was their son, and then there's this Nimrod. He seems great, according to the text, right? So he stands out so much, and one reason, because God basically gives him a nickname, which is a pretty cool thing. Right? They're like, well, God always said this about Nimrod, so that becomes like a saying, right? So there's no way to really identify Nimrod historically. Though some have tried, some have said, oh, well, Nimrod, he must have been one of the evil rulers of Babylon. It's certainly possible. There's no evidence for that in the text. It says he's a great hunter, right? There is, however, evidence to suggest that Nimrod, in his little tag, might be a later addition to the text, which might explain why he stands out so much. So here's the evidence. You can take this or leave this, right? So see what you think about this. Without Nimrod's name, there are 70 names in the list of the genealogy. When you add Nimrod, it goes to 71. But without Nimrod, there's 70 names. We're going to see throughout the Hebrew Scriptures that 7 and multiples of 7 play a big role in the Scriptures. And so someone might suggest that if there would have been 70 names, it would have been a symbol of completion. It would have showed that these 70 descendants, with their various names of places, that is the completion of the entire peoples of the world. And that's why there was a list of, why you would put it in a list of 70, because it would have said something in addition to what the word said. The number would have said something as well. 71, of course, would not be the same. So there's some suggestion that maybe Nimrod was a later addition. We don't really know who he is or who he was. But again, God seems to have valued his ability to hunt, I guess. So that's the story of Nimrod. So our next is the Tower of Babel, chapter 11. And the question is that I received, is the Tower of Babel a historical story or a metaphor? Before we answer that question, chapter 10 and 11 set together is another example in Genesis, I think, of two versions of the same history. Basically. Not exactly, but basically. The first explanation of how did people spread out throughout the world shows up in chapter 10 with the story of Noah's descendants. Right? So the descendants of the sons went in different directions, and we see this as we look at the different places. They're grouped in different directions. Also, there's a note in verse 25 of chapter 10 that talks about the days of Peleg. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I don't know him, and neither do you, so that's okay. So Peleg, it is said, during his life, there was a division in the earth, right? And so it's suggesting that at that verse in chapter 25, that it was during Peleg's life when folks started to spread out to these different places. That's suggested in chapter 10. And then, if that's the case, if that's the first instance of people spreading out, the story of the Tower of Babel comes after that in Genesis. It comes in the next chapter, chapter 11. And people are all back together, right? And so it could be that that's the first explanation of how people spread across the earth in the Tower of Babel. It then becomes the second explanation of how people spread out across the earth. Also, interestingly, it seems like the Tower of Babel story might be one of the oldest preserved stories in all of Scripture. The Tower of Babel story. So some scholars would say this is, again, the two voices that we've been hearing, the priestly source. And the priestly source would be the chapter 10 source, and then the J source, the Yah source, as being chapter 11, telling the same story set side by side like we've seen throughout a lot of Genesis. So back to the question, is this story historical or is it metaphorical? So I would say maybe both. There seems to be some ancient memory preserved in this story. We can see this a little bit of evidence. First off, the way that bricks are described as being made in the story was the way that ancient Mesopotamian cultures made bricks. This is the way that they made them. Not every culture made them this way, but it seems like ancient Mesopotamian cultures made bricks in the way described in this chapter of Genesis. They also describe it in terms of ancient architectural styles that would have been popular in the ancient world. That's also part of it. Even the dispersion of one human collective spreading out and leaving one place to go and set up civilizations in other places could be rooted in an ancient memory of humanity. There would be a group, and eventually, as they start to diversify, and they start spreading out across other parts of the world. So there seems to be that there could be an ancient memory preserved in this story. And so we ask ourselves, what's the point of this story? And I think that there's a few goals of this story. So once again, it's an origin story, right? The author uses this to explain the development of language, the dispersion of cities and nations, all explained in this one story. Everybody's together, they have one language, and then by the end of the story, people are spreading out over the world, and they have different languages. They can't communicate with each other, and folks leave, and they spread out, and the world starts to grow and change. Another thing, too, would be to show again, the authors of Genesis will show us again human disobedience. We've seen this in pretty much every story, right? God has certain expectations, certain commandments. People fail to live up to that. And we know from the Noah story that God knows this will happen. Right? We remember after the flood, God looks at the situation and realizes, this is going to keep happening. And so I need to make a decision here about how we're going to go forward. And we remember from the Noah story that God's decision was, it's going to keep happening, so I guess I need to stick with him. And so this is another example of human disobedience that God knows was going to happen. In chapter 9, God said, go and fill the earth. Remember that from the Noah story. Go and fill the earth. And the people decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go, and we're not going to fill the earth. We're going to stay here. So the people decide once again, like they have since the Adam and Eve story, and remember this is the Yah story, which also gave us the Adam and Eve, where the people decided, I think we know better. So it starts with eating the fruit from the forbidden tree in the second creation story. It's the same thing basically that's happening here, where the people said, you said go, we decided we're going to stay. That seems like a better choice. And we're going to stay in one city, we're not going to fill the earth, and we're going to then erect a giant symbol to show our ideas better. A monument to stay, right? The third reason, possible reason, it could be a little bit here that the Hebrews, the authors, were trolling the Babylonians. So you're going to remember that many of these stories in Genesis were finally formed around the time of the Babylonian exile and the time of the Babylonian Empire. So in the Akkadian language, the word for Babel is gate of the god. So their great city in the empire is Babylon. This great city, this gate of the god. Well, in Hebrew, very similar word, essentially the same, sounding the same, a little play here. The same word in Hebrew means mix up or to confuse. And so it seems like there's some subtle play here with the more powerful empire of throwing in a little story that says, one, you think your city's great, kind of a mess. You think you're building something great here? God's going to have the last word on what you think you've built that's so great. And here's a story that proves it. So there's another thing. There's also some other subtle humor in this story. So the people are building a tower to the heavens, right? They're building this tower to the heavens. And yet, in the story it says God has to come down, all the way down from heaven, to even see what's really going on, right? So they think they're building it all the way up. It still seems that it's very far from God. And so God has to come down. God comes down to see what they're doing. God comes down to get to these people who think they have created this monument to the skies, to the heavens. There's also some implicit humor, which is the idea of folks waking up one morning, going to work on their big tower, and showing up and having no clue what anyone is saying. Right? So you can riff on that. There's how those interactions turn out. I mean, eventually all the people leave each other, so clearly it wasn't going so well. But to go from being able to talk to everybody and the next morning waking up, talking to somebody and them not understanding what you're saying, and maybe they misunderstand what you're saying, and then there's conflicts and arguments, people slapping each other, whatnot. So to answer the question, this story works on a number of levels, right? Is it historical? Is it metaphorical? I suggested both. It works on a number of levels. And it's interesting, this story, the story of the Tower of Babel, it is 9 verses in the Bible. Much shorter than that genealogy you read in chapter 10, or the genealogy that follows it at the end of chapter 11. It's this little story. But I really do think it captures the imagination, doesn't it? It's an interesting story. And so there seems to be some ancient memory in this story. This ancient memory of urban development and human arrogance and how that all went down and how people were scattered and how people left each other. It's also this origin story, because it's also a way to explain language and cities and nations. And also, it's yet another metaphor for humanity, not just these people, but for all of humanity's inability to be in a truly obedient relationship with God. Right? So we can look at this story and we can say, yeah, maybe something like this happened, and that's fine. And we can look at the same story and we can say that this is a story clearly that's explaining the development of a variety of languages. And we can look at the story all at the same time, I think hold all these together and say, that sounds kind of familiar. That wasn't the last time something like this happened. And I think we can hold all those together. And I think they hold together pretty nicely, actually. One of the difficult elements, I think, about the Babel story, the Tower of Babel story, is that the story tells us basically that it was God's work, that God intentionally divided and separated people. It's a challenging part of the story, don't you think? The idea that all these folks were getting along, or at least communicating, and then God decided, I'm not having this. I don't like all these people getting along so well. Right? So I think that's one of the difficult parts of this story. So God divides these people into different tribes and different nations, and is that a good thing? And also, as Christians, we're very familiar with the New Testament, and that doesn't seem to be the same message as the New Testament. It doesn't seem entirely, or at least easily, compatible with much of the New Testament. I mean, we're called to be ministers of reconciliation. And yet, here's God, separating people. And we're called to, bring folks together. It's a little confusing. It doesn't seem what Jesus' ministry is necessarily about. I wish none of these people would be in relationship anymore. If I can just get them apart. So, one of the stories I think is really interesting in the New Testament, when we think about it in relationship with the Tower of Babel story, is that we remember that there's another time in the Bible where there's an introduction of many languages, right? And that's the story of Pentecost. So we have the story of Tower of Babel here. Everybody speaks in different languages, and it causes them to leave each other. It causes division. It causes them to abandon their project. It causes them to spread out. In the book of Acts, something similar happens, where all the folks go out and they're all speaking in different languages, and yet a very different goal. Both are initiated by God, but the stories are not the same. In the second story, in the story in Acts, all these different languages are intended not to separate people, but they're intended to spread the gospel and build a united church. It's almost like a reversal of the Babel moment. It's the same thing in many ways, but it becomes almost a reversal of this story. God keeps us on our toes, right? The same trick, but with very different results. The same basic story, but the ending is completely different. So I don't know what time it is. Does anybody know what time it is? 6:48? 6:49? So we're going to wrap on Facebook Live and remind folks to read Genesis chapters 12 through 17 next week. Thank you for being here.